Picture this. You are a seasoned scout for the Golden Horde. It is the dead of winter in 1287, and the wind cutting across the Polish plains feels like shattered glass against your face. You have ridden across half the known world. You are used to seeing peasants flee at the mere thunder of your horses. You are used to the smell of burning thatch and the sight of terrified kings begging for their lives on blood-soaked fields. But today, as you stare into the freezing mist, there is no panic. There is no fire. There is only a deafening, unnatural silence. The villages are empty. The fields are stripped to the frozen dirt. Your horse shivers, its ribs pressing against its skin, starving and exhausted. You look up and see it, a towering fortress of solid stone, mocking your bows, mocking your speed. You realize with a sudden freezing dread that you are not the hunter anymore. You have ridden thousands of miles straight into a colossal, meticulously designed death trap. This is the winter campaign of 1288, and the story of how Poland broke the spine of the Mongol war machine using nothing but stone, starvation, and a brutal tactical genius. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the sheer magnitude of this trap, you have to understand the nightmare that was the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. They were an apocalyptic force, a rolling meat grinder of horseflesh and recurved bows that had already pulverized empires from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. They did not just defeat armies, they erased civilizations. They operated on speed, terror, and the absolute paralysis of their enemies. Their war horses drank blood from open veins when water was scarce, and their warriors could sleep in the saddle while riding over the bones of their victims. When the Tumans of the Golden Horde rode out, the world held its breath. But in the winter of 1287, the massive army led by the terrifying warlord Nogai Khan and his co-commander Talabuga was riding into a very different Poland. They expected the same easy slaughter their grandfathers had enjoyed decades earlier. They expected wooden palisades to burn to the ground, disorganized knights to run down in open fields, and granaries overflowing with winter wheat for their thousands of horses. They expected a quick, brutal harvest of human flesh and gold. Instead, they found a ghost town the size of a country. The ruler of Poland, Duke Leszek the Black, knew he could not beat the Mongols in an open cavalry charge. That was sheer suicide. You do not outrun a Mongol, and you certainly do not outshoot one. So Leszek did something entirely unexpected, something so cold and calculating that it fundamentally shifted the balance of medieval warfare. He looked at the invincible Mongol war machine, dissected its mechanics, and found its fatal physiological flaw. The Mongols relied entirely on momentum and endless grazing land. They needed constant movement to feed their mounts and constant victories to feed their morale. If you take away the food, the horses die. If the horses die, the greatest cavalrymen on earth become stranded pedestrians in a freezing, hostile wasteland. Leszek ordered a total, ruthless implementation of scorched earth. Every sack of grain, every herd of cattle, every able-bodied peasant was pulled behind massive, newly reinforced stone walls. What he left behind was a frozen desert, completely devoid of sustenance. When Nogai Khan crossed the border, expecting to unleash a blitzkrieg of terror, his horses dug their hooves into frozen mud that yielded absolutely no grass. His terrifying light cavalry, designed to shoot and scoot, suddenly found themselves staring up at impenetrable stone fortresses holding bows that were entirely useless against thick mortar and heavy rock. The invaders were locked outside in the biting cold, their fingers numbing around their bowstrings while the prey sat comfortably inside by the fire. The invincible apocalypse had just been placed in a chokehold. The trap was set, the jaws were open, and the freezing wind of the Polish winter was about to snap them shut. To comprehend the icy brilliance of the 1288 trap, you have to rewind 46 years and wade through a river of blood. The year is 1241, and Poland is not fighting a war, it is enduring an extermination. The first Mongol invasion did not just defeat the Polish armies, it butchered them with an industrial, terrifying efficiency that Europe had never witnessed. At the Battle of Legnica, the Christian forces were not just beaten, they were physically harvested. The Mongols collected 9 massive sacks of right ears from the dead just to keep an accurate body count for their commanders. Prosperous towns were turned into smoking, silent mass graves. Grand cathedrals became slaughterhouses. The air across the entire continent tasted of ash and copper. When the horde finally packed up their wagons and rode east, they left behind a traumatized, blackened wasteland. For a generation, Polish mothers used the threat of the steppe riders to terrify their children into obedience. The sheer, unadulterated trauma of that slaughter was etched deeply into the very DNA of the nation. But here is where the story of Poland diverges from a standard historical tragedy and transforms into a masterclass in psychological resilience. Most nations, after suffering a catastrophic, apocalyptic defeat, simply crumble. They cower behind their ruined timber walls, rebuilding blindly, and pray to God the monsters never return. The Poles did something entirely different. They wiped the dried blood from their faces, walked back out into the killing fields among the skeletons of their fathers, and started taking meticulous notes. They refused to look at the Mongols as supernatural demons sent by a vengeful god, even though the Church desperately tried to frame it exactly that way. Instead, a new generation of cold, pragmatic Polish military minds began to view the Golden Horde as a machine. And like any machine, if you study its bloody gears, its pulleys, and its fuel source long enough, you can figure out exactly how to dismantle it. They began by dissecting the anatomy of their own humiliating defeat. In 1241, the proud Polish knights had marched out into the open fields, heavily armored, tragically slow, and blinded by arrogance. They had expected an honorable, head-on clash of steel. The Mongols had responded with a suffocating shower of armor-piercing arrows, feigned retreats that stretched the Polish lines until they shattered, and a terrifying fluid mobility that made them seem like they were attacking from all directions at once. The Poles realized that fighting a Mongol army on a flat plain was like trying to punch a swarm of hornets with a broadsword. It was a mathematical impossibility. The Mongols possessed superior range, unmatched speed, and a telepathic command structure orchestrated by silent flag signals that moved thousands of killers with the precision of a flock of birds. But in their obsessive, sleepless study of the enemy, the Polish strategists found the fatal crack in the armor. It was not a physical weakness in the men. The average Mongol warrior was arguably the most resilient, hardened killer on the planet, entirely capable of surviving on fermented mare's milk, dried meat strips, and the raw blood drawn directly from his horse's neck. The vulnerability was not the rider, it was the ride. The entire Mongol Empire, their terrifying speed, their psychological dominance, and their logistical superiority rested entirely on the backs of their tough, shaggy steppe ponies. A single Mongol warrior traveled with a string of up to 5 remounts to maintain his blistering pace. An invasion force of 30,000 men meant a staggering, mind-boggling herd of over 150,000 horses. That is a colossal amount biological mass, and that mass had a non-negotiable, fatal requirement. It needed to eat constantly. The Mongols were not a traditional European army tethered to slow, vulnerable supply wagons. They were an apex parasite that fed off the land itself, chewing through pastures like a plague of locusts. If the land was green and plentiful, the horde was an unstoppable force of nature. But if the land was barren, the machines sputtered, choked, and died. The Poles realized that the secret to defeating the Golden Horde was not to forge better swords or breed heavier warhorses. The secret was to target their fuel supply. You do not kill a Mongol army by stabbing its soldiers. You eradicate it by starving its animals. This cold, clinical realization became the dark foundation of a radical new military doctrine. The Polish leadership made a silent vow that if the horde ever dared to cross their borders again, they would not find a glorious battlefield. They would find a freezing, empty vacuum of death. To execute a strategy this ruthless, you need a leader who has completely severed himself from the romantic delusions of chivalry. Enter Duke Leszek the Black. He was not a king who cared about glorious cavalry charges, shining armor, or the heroic songs bards would sing about his bravery in the great halls. He cared about one thing and one thing only: survival. When his network of spies reported that the Golden Horde was massing on the eastern borders, preparing to unleash a third wave of apocalyptic violence upon his people, Leszek did not call his banners for a massive, climactic showdown. He knew that putting heavily armored, slow-moving knights on a flat plain against a swarm of Mongol horse archers was not a battle strategy. It was an elaborate, heavily choreographed mass suicide. He had read the agonizing reports from the slaughter of 1241. He knew perfectly well that the Mongols desperately wanted him to march out. They wanted the Polish nobility to line up neatly in their heavy steel so they could be enveloped, exhausted, and systematically butchered like livestock. Leszek looked at the traditional, centuries-old European playbook for medieval war, threw it straight into the fire, and decided to rewrite the fundamental rules of engagement. He understood a brutal, unyielding truth about asymmetric warfare. You never fight the enemy where they are strongest, and you absolutely never give them the war they have meticulously prepared for. The Mongols were the undisputed, terrifying masters of the open field. Their entire nomadic culture, their lifelong training in the saddle, their devastating composite bows, and their telepathic maneuvering were optimized for vast, unhindered spaces. To defeat them, Leszek had to take away that space. He had to force a hypermobile, fluid army of steppe warriors to fight in a claustrophobic, unforgiving environment. But how exactly do you stop a tidal wave of 30,000 screaming horsemen? You do not try to build a dam to hold it back. You drain the ocean. Leszek's defiance was not born of hot-headed anger or misplaced pride, but of cold, calculating logistics. He issued sweeping orders that sent absolute shockwaves through the proud Polish nobility. The older lords, men whose fathers and uncles had died screaming decades earlier, were furious. They demanded to ride out, to meet the invaders with lances lowered, to reclaim their stolen honor in a storm of blood. Leszek looked at them with cold, dead eyes and told them that honor does not stop an armor-piercing arrow. Honor does not feed a starving nation. He made it violently clear that anyone who rode out to face the Mongols in the open would not just be considered a fool. They would be executed as a traitor to the survival of the state. There would be no heroic last stands. There would be no meeting the enemy at the border to defend the imaginary lines on a map. Instead, he commanded his people to retreat. But this was not a panicked, chaotic flight. It was a highly organized tactical withdrawal born of pure strategic genius. He ordered the systematic, frantic fortification of key cities and the reinforcement of existing stone castles. Mortar was mixed, stones were hauled, and defensive perimeters were hardened. And then he gave the most brutal, heart-wrenching command of all. He ordered his people to strip the land bare. Leszek realized that the Mongol war machine ran on calories. An army of that immense size, moving at that terrifying speed, required hundreds of tons of food and forage every single day just to function. The Polish winter was already looming as a harsh, unforgiving enemy, and Leszek decided to fully weaponize it. He commanded his peasants to harvest everything early, slaughter the livestock they could not bring inside the massive walls, and burn whatever was left in the fields. He was intentionally turning his own realm into a barren, freezing wasteland. He was willing to inflict catastrophic economic devastation on his own country just to ensure that when the Mongol horses finally arrived, they would find nothing but ash, black ice, and starvation. The Duke had essentially built a massive country-sized trap, baiting the greatest conquerors the world had ever seen to step inside and slowly, agonizingly freeze to death. The scorched earth policy was the agonizing hunger of the trap, but starvation alone takes time. To make the trap truly lethal, Leszek the Black needed an anvil against which the Mongol war machine would inevitably break its teeth. He found that anvil in the earth itself. He looked at the traditional defenses of Eastern Europe, the sprawling wooden palisades, the earthen mounds, the timber watchtowers, and he realized they were nothing but kindling for the Golden Horde. The Mongols were masters of siege engineering when it came to wood. They utilized captured engineers, burning naphtha, and massive waves of slave labor to tear down timber fortresses with terrifying speed. Wood was a tactical liability. Stone was salvation. Leszek completely overhauled the architectural and defensive doctrine of his realm. He emptied the royal treasuries, diverting every ounce of silver and gold away from fielding a massive standing army, and poured it directly into the hands of stonemasons, quarrymen, and architects. Cities that had been reduced to ashes in 1241, like Krakow and Sandomierz, were rebuilt not as sprawling economic hubs, but as brutal utilitarian fortresses. Massive curtain walls of solid, mortared rock were dragged from the earth and erected toward the sky. Gatehouses were heavily reinforced with thick iron portcullises. Deep, freezing moats were carved directly into the bedrock. This was not just a defensive measure, it was the construction of a colossal national bear trap. Leszek was systematically altering the physical geography of Poland to completely nullify the tactical advantages of a nomadic cavalry. A Mongol horseman is a terrifying god of war on an open steppe. He can shoot a bird out of the sky while riding at a full gallop. He can outflank a heavy cavalry charge before the enemy commander even realizes what is happening, but put that same god of war at the base of a 30-foot vertical wall of solid rock, and he becomes entirely useless. A composite bow, a masterpiece of lethal engineering that can punch through chainmail at 100 yards, is absolutely worthless against a limestone block. The Polish strategy was designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical frustration. Leszek knew that the Mongols relied on momentum. They were a kinetic force. When they hit a target, it shattered, and they kept moving. But a stone castle does not shatter. It stands there, silent, immovable, and defiant. By pulling the entire surviving population, along with the heavily armored knights, the infantry, and the stockpiled grain, behind these impenetrable walls, Leszek created isolated islands of survival in a sea of freezing starvation. He essentially forced a hyperactive, sweeping predatory force into a state of agonizing paralysis. Imagine the sheer indignity and horror for a warrior of the Golden Horde, a man born in the saddle, taught to conquer the horizon, now forced to stand knee-deep in freezing slush, staring up at a featureless wall of grey rock. Every arrow he fires harmlessly shatters against the mortar. Meanwhile, the Polish defenders, well fed and protected behind stone battlements, can rain down heavy crossbow bolts and rocks with total impunity. He was daring the horde to stop. If the Mongols bypassed the castles, they would find nothing to eat in the scorched countryside, and their massive herds of horses would slowly die in the snow. If they stopped to lay siege to the stone fortresses, they would bleed their momentum, lose their mobility, and expose themselves to the brutal Polish winter. They would be forced to dismount, wade through freezing mud, and fight a grinding, miserable infantry war of attrition, the exact type of warfare they despised and were least equipped to handle. The trap was mechanically flawless. The bait was the wealthy heartland of Poland, but the teeth of the trap were the fortified cities, and the spring that would snap those teeth shut was the bitter, unforgiving cold. As the year 1287 drew to a close, the frantic sound of hammers and chisels finally faded across the Polish landscape. The massive wooden doors were barred shut, the granaries were locked tight, the people of Poland huddled around their hearth fires, listening to the howling wind, waiting for the storm to break. The anvil was set. All they needed now was the hammer of the Golden Horde to strike it. To understand the sheer arrogance of the invaders, you need to look at the man leading the southern pincer of the Golden Horde. Nogai Khan was not some untested prince looking for a name to make. He was the undisputed kingmaker of the Mongol Empire, a ruthless, battle-scarred warlord who had spent his entire adult life orchestrating the slaughter of nations. He had been there during the first apocalyptic invasion in 1241. He remembered the smell of the burning Polish cities. He remembered how easily the European knights had shattered under the weight of his cavalry. So, when he crossed the frozen border into southern Poland in late 1287 with an army of hardened veterans, he was not expecting a war. He was expecting a harvest. Beside him, commanding the northern forces, was Talabuga Khan. Together they led a combined force of roughly 30,000 warriors. But as we have established, you cannot just count the men, you have to count the horses. Over 100,000 animals chewing through the landscape, their hooves churning the freezing mud into a pulverized paste. The noise of their approach alone was meant to be a psychological weapon, a rolling thunder that paralyzed defenders with absolute terror before the first arrow was even nocked. They rode in with the supreme confidence of an apex predator that has never once been challenged in the wild. But as the days dragged on, the rolling thunder of the Golden Horde was swallowed by an unnatural, terrifying silence. Nogai Khan sent his fastest light cavalry scouts ahead to locate the Polish army, to find the vulnerable peasant villages, and to secure the massive stockpiles of winter grain required to feed his colossal biological engine. The scouts rode for miles across the freezing plains. They rode until their horses foamed at the mouth and their faces went numb from the biting wind, and they found absolutely nothing. Every village they encountered was a ghost town. The doors were swinging open in the wind, the hearths were cold, the granaries were swept completely clean, down to the last single grain of wheat. The fields, which should have contained the stubble of the autumn harvest for their horses to graze on, had been burned black, and were now covered in a suffocating layer of hard-packed snow and black ice. The Mongols were perfectly used to their enemies running away, but they were not used to their enemies taking the entire landscape with them. At first, Talabuga and Nogai likely viewed this as the pathetic cowardice of a broken nation. They pushed deeper into the Polish heartland, assuming the panicked population had simply bottlenecked further down the road. But as they pushed deeper, the brutal reality of Leszek the Black's trap began to close its jaws around them. The winter of 1287 was not just cold, it was a meteorological nightmare. The temperature plummeted, the wind cut across the flat plains like invisible razors, and then the unthinkable began to happen. The legendary Mongol steppe pony, the tough, ugly, invincible animal that had conquered half the globe, began to fail. These horses were biologically adapted to dig through snow with their hooves to find grass beneath. But there was no grass. The Polish peasants had ripped it out or burned it to ash. The horses were striking solid, frozen mud. The caloric deficit began immediately. Without food, the horses could not generate enough body heat to survive the plunging temperatures. A terrifying sound began to replace the triumphant war cries of the Golden Horde. It was the sound of massive animals collapsing in the snow, their lungs rattling, their ribs pressing sharply against their skin. When a Mongol warrior's horse dies, he does not just lose his transportation, he loses his tactical supremacy, his speed, his height advantage, and his psychological edge. He goes from being the fastest killer on earth to a freezing, exhausted man wearing heavy furs, stranded in hostile territory. As Nogai Khan stared out at the freezing wasteland, watching his invincible cavalry slowly transform into a desperate, starving mob of foot soldiers, he finally understood. This was not a retreat, this was a highly orchestrated execution, and the executioner was the winter itself. Scorched earth is an incredibly sanitized term for a deeply horrific reality. In the safety of a modern history book, it sounds like a clever, sterile strategic doctrine. But on the ground, in the freezing mud of the 13th century, it is the deliberate, organized murder of an entire ecosystem. When Leszek the Black ordered the destruction of his own countryside, he did not just burn the autumn harvest, he erased the very concept of sustenance. He commanded his people to create a vast, uninhabitable void. Imagine walking for days through a landscape that looks like the surface of a dead planet, dusted in a blinding, freezing white. Beneath that heavy snow lies a thick crust of black ice and the charred, pulverized remains of what used to be fertile pasture. For the vast herds of the Golden Horde, this was a biological death sentence. The legendary steppe pony was a miracle of evolutionary engineering. It was specifically built to survive harsh winters by scraping away deep snow with its toughened hooves to graze on the dormant grass trapped underneath. But in the Polish winter of 1287, their hooves scraped through the snow and struck solid, unyielding permafrost mixed with dead ash. There was no grass, not a single pathetic blade. The caloric math of the Mongol invasion began to collapse with a terrifying mathematical certainty. A horse burning massive amounts of energy just to maintain its core body temperature in sub-zero winds requires constant fuel. Without that fuel, the biological engine begins to brutally consume its own muscle tissue. The mighty herds of Talabuga and Nogai Khan, numbering well over 100,000 animals, began to drop in staggering numbers. The plains of southern Poland rapidly transformed into a sprawling, freezing graveyard of emaciated horse flesh. And as the horses died, the very fabric of the Mongol military doctrine completely unraveled. The terrifying, lightning-fast speed that allowed them to outmaneuver and outflank any army in the known world simply vanished. Their complex, almost telepathic communication system, which relied heavily on swift riders coordinating massive, sweeping formations across vast distances, was entirely severed. The tumbling, unstoppable avalanche of the Golden Horde was reduced to a slow, agonizing crawl. The invaders were suddenly blind, sluggish, and desperately cold. A Mongol warrior without his horse is like a great white shark pulled onto a beach. The apex predator of the deep is instantly transformed into a thrashing, helpless victim crushed by its own weight. The men themselves were now starving alongside their animals. Their traditional supply lines, which consisted entirely of whatever they could loot, pillage, and extract from terrified local peasants, were completely non-existent. There were no peasants left to terrorize, there was no grain left to steal. Too, the hardened veterans of 100 campaigns were reduced to violently butchering their own dying mounts, boiling the tough, stringy meat over pathetic, smoky fires made from whatever damp, frozen twigs they could scavenge from the dead earth. The psychological toll of this invisible war was arguably worse than the physical starvation. The Mongols were masters of psychological warfare. They were completely accustomed to intimidating their foes into rapid submission, using terror as their primary weapon. But how exactly do you intimidate a blizzard? How do you terrorize a sheer wall of limestone? The highly disciplined, deeply feared Tumans began to fracture under the sheer weight of their own impotence. Starving men do not care about military discipline. They care about their next meal. Meanwhile, completely safe inside their heavily fortified stone castles, the Polish defenders simply watched. They did not need to launch daring, suicidal night raids. They did not need to risk their lives firing volleys of arrows into the dark. They just stood on their high battlements, wrapped in thick wool, their bellies full of the grain they had meticulously hidden away, and watched the apocalypse freeze to death at their doorstep. It was a masterclass in psychological torture. The greatest, most feared conquerors on the planet were dying in the dirt, not from a superior sword stroke or a brilliant cavalry charge, but from the quiet, suffocating, absolute apathy of the winter. Leszek the Black had locked the Golden Horde inside a massive open-air freezer, and he was completely content to let them rot. By late winter, the once unstoppable force of the Golden Horde had been reduced to an emaciated, shivering shadow of its former glory. Nogai Khan and Talabuga were bleeding momentum by the hour. Their horses were dead or dying, and the men were boiling their leather saddles just to have something to chew on. They desperately needed a victory, but more importantly, they needed calories. The massive stone walls of Stary Sachs appeared on the freezing horizon not as a glorious military target, but as a locked pantry holding the only food within 100 miles. It was here, at the base of this impenetrable fortress, that the psychological breaking point of the Mongol war machine truly manifested. The siege of Stary Sachs was not a grand tactical engagement. It was a chaotic, desperate act of biological survival. To assault the city, the Mongols were forced to endure the ultimate cultural and tactical humiliation. They had to dismount. A steppe warrior separated from his horse is no longer a god of the open plains. He is merely a man, heavily burdened by thick furs, forced to trudge through knee-deep, freezing slush. The invincible cavalrymen were reduced to slipping and crawling through the icy mud, dragging makeshift ladders toward walls that seemed to touch the grey, unforgiving sky. Imagine the sheer psychological terror and cognitive dissonance echoing inside the minds of these invaders. These were men who had been indoctrinated since birth to believe they were the literal wrath of heaven. They belonged to an empire that had pulverized the greatest cities of Asia and Eastern Europe. They were accustomed to seeing kings beg for mercy in the dirt. But now, staring up at the sheer, unyielding limestone of Stary Sachs, that legendary arrogance evaporated into raw, screaming panic. They knocked their devastating armor-piercing arrows, drew back their immense composite bows with freezing, trembling fingers, and fired. The result was an agonizing display of absolute impotence. The arrows, designed to punch through heavy steel breastplates and shatter wooden shields, simply sparked against the solid rock and fell harmlessly into the snow. The Mongols fired volley after volley, screaming in frustration, watching their most lethal weapon be rendered entirely obsolete by the basic geometry of a stone wall. They were trying to bleed a mountain, and the mountain did not care. Up on the battlements, the Polish defenders experienced a profound shift in perspective. The terrifying demons of the East, the monsters who had haunted their nightmares for 46 years, were right below them, and they looked utterly pathetic. The Poles did not need to engage in complex tactical maneuvers. They simply dropped heavy rocks. They fired heavy crossbow bolts directly into the packed, disorganized mass of starving men below. They poured boiling water and watched it freeze almost instantly upon the dying bodies of the invaders. The defenders were well fed, warm and protected, systematically slaughtering the greatest conquerors on earth from the comfort of their own balconies. As the siege dragged on over days, the Mongol camp outside the walls devolved into a freezing hellscape of disease and despair. The temperature continued to plummet. Frostbite began to rot the extremities of the warriors. A composite bow is a weapon that requires immense grip strength and precise dexterity, both of which are completely impossible when your fingers have turned black and numb from the cold. The few remaining horses were violently butchered, and when that stringy, frozen meat ran out, the starving men fought each other for the scraps. The siege of Stary Sachs broke the mind of the Golden Horde before it broke their bodies. The realization that their speed, their terror, and their supreme confidence had abandoned them in the Polish winter stripped away their discipline. They were no longer an army. They were a trapped, panicked animal, violently thrashing against the bars of a cage that Leszek the Black had built perfectly. And while the Mongols bled themselves dry against the unyielding stone, the final fatal component of the Polish trap was quietly mobilizing in the snowy forests behind them. The true genius of a trap is not just in catching the prey. It is in knowing exactly when to walk up and put a spear through its heart. Leszek the Black had spent the entire winter systematically degrading the Golden Horde from an apocalyptic threat into a shivering, disorganized mob. But starvation is a slow executioner, and Leszek wanted to ensure that this generation of Mongols would never even think about crossing his borders again. He did not just want them to retreat, he wanted to physically break them. And to do that, he had quietly assembled a coalition of killers while the invaders were busy freezing to death outside the walls of Stary Sachs. While Nogai Khan and Talabuga were helplessly throwing their men against impenetrable stone, Leszek had sent urgent riders south to the Kingdom of Hungary. King Ladislaus IV understood the assignment perfectly. He dispatched a fresh, heavily armed relief force of Hungarian and Cuman warriors to march north and link up with the surviving Polish knights. These were not the terrified, disorganized defenders of 1241. These men had spent the winter resting in warm castles, eating heavily and sharpening their steel. Their war horses were strong, grain-fed, and ready to sprint. When the combined Polish and Hungarian forces finally materialized from the snow-choked forests surrounding Stary Sachs, they did not announce their presence with a polite challenge. They hit the Mongol camp like a localized earthquake. Imagine the sheer, unparalleled terror of that moment for a warrior of the Golden Horde. For months, you have been dying by inches. You have eaten your own horse. You have watched your brothers lose their fingers to frostbite. You are standing ankle-deep in freezing mud, staring at a stone wall, completely exhausted, and then suddenly the ground begins to vibrate. You turn around, and erupting from the tree line is a massive wall of heavy European cavalry. Under normal circumstances, on a dry summer plain, the Mongols would have welcomed a heavy cavalry charge. They would have simply mounted their swift steppe ponies, feigned a retreat, and shot the charging knights to pieces. But the steppe ponies were dead. The Mongols were on foot, trapped in a claustrophobic valley entirely choked with deep snow and mud. They could not run. They could not outflank. And because their fingers were practically rotting from frostbite, they could not even draw their legendary composite bows to defend themselves. The Polish counterpunch was not a battle. It was an industrial-scale slaughter. The heavily armored knights lowered their lances and simply drove their massive, grain-fed war horses straight into the huddled, freezing masses of the Mongol infantry. It was like driving a snowplow through a crowd of helpless pedestrians. The impact was deafening. The invaders were trampled into the freezing mud, their brittle, frozen bodies shattering under the immense weight of the European destriers. For the first time in their terrifying history, the hunters of the steppe had been transformed into stationary, defenseless targets. The Polish infantry poured out from the gates of starry sacks, eager to join the bloodbath. They fell upon the survivors with axes, maces, and halberds, taking a brutal, visceral revenge for the 46 years of trauma their nation had endured. The Mongols, men who had conquered continents, found themselves fighting desperately with broken swords and frozen hands, slipping in the blood of their comrades. Talabuga and Nogai Khan watched their invincible war machine completely disintegrate in a matter of minutes. The telepathic command structure, the unbreakable discipline, the sheer arrogance of the Golden Horde evaporated into a chorus of panicked screams. The commanders realized that if they stayed, they would be butchered to the last man. They sounded the retreat, but it was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a completely blind, terrified stampede. The invincible apocalypse had finally been broken, and as they turned and ran into the merciless Polish winter, the real nightmare was only just beginning. In medieval warfare, the vast majority of casualties do not happen during the clash of the battle line, they happen during the rout. When a military formation breaks, it ceases to be an army and instantly becomes a panicked herd of prey. For the Golden Horde, a military machine that prided itself on absolute discipline, silent communication, and highly coordinated feigned retreats, a genuine terrified stampede was completely unprecedented. They were not falling back to regroup, they were running for their lives, and running through knee-deep snow while actively starving to death is a physiological impossibility. The Polish and Hungarian heavy cavalry did not just let them go. Leszek the Black had ordered an absolute cleansing of his realm, and his knights were more than happy to oblige. For decades, the Polish nobility had lived with the humiliating ghost of 1241, the bitter memory of their grandfathers being slaughtered in the mud, while the invaders laughed. Now the roles were entirely and violently reversed. They rode down the stragglers with ruthless mechanical efficiency. The frozen plains became a horrific sprawling hunting ground. Armored knights on massive grain-fed war horses casually trotted behind the exhausted, staggering invaders, picking them off one by one with lowered lances and heavy steel maces. It was not combat, it was pest control. The Mongols dumped their bows, their armor, and any stolen silver they possessed, desperately trying to shed any weight that was slowing them down. But it did not matter. You cannot outrun a galloping destrier when your own muscles are actively cannibalizing themselves from caloric collapse. As if the European steel was not enough, the Polish winter delivered its final, devastating blow. A massive blizzard swept across the retreating horde, dropping the temperature even further and completely erasing the roads. The retreating columns of Talabuga and Nogai Khan splintered into isolated, desperate bands, lost in a blinding whiteout. Men simply sat down in the snow, too exhausted and numb to take another single step, and froze solid within hours. The routes leading east out of Poland were quite literally paved with the frozen, twisted bodies of the greatest warriors on earth. But the true, stomach-churning horror of this retreat is what happened to the desperate survivors who somehow managed to keep moving. The starvation had reached a terminal, catastrophic phase. With absolutely no food, no horses left to butcher, and the landscape still aggressively stripped bare by Leszek's scorched earth policy, the legendary Brotherhood of the Horde devolved into pure primal savagery. The historical chronicles of the era paint a picture so incredibly grim that it feels like something out of a psychological horror film. To endure the agonizing, freezing march back toward the safety of the Rus principalities, the Mongol warriors crossed the ultimate taboo line. They turned on each other. They resorted to cannibalism. Men who had ridden side by side, who had conquered entire cities together, now looked at their wounded brothers not as comrades, but as calories. They butchered the fallen and ate their own dead in the freezing mud just to keep their hearts beating for one more day. The apocalyptic army that had ridden into Poland expecting to feast on the wealth of a nation was now reduced to eating itself alive in the snow. It was the ultimate, humiliating destruction of an invincible myth. By the time the pathetic, broken remnants of the Golden Horde finally crossed back over the eastern border, they were no longer an army. They were a traumatized, starving mob of survivors utterly shattered by a trap they never even saw coming. When the starving, cannibalistic remnants of the Golden Horde finally dragged themselves back across the eastern border, they left behind more than just the frozen, shattered corpses of their brothers. They left behind the single most powerful weapon in the entire Mongol arsenal, their myth of absolute invincibility. For 46 agonizing years, the people of Eastern Europe had lived under the paralyzing delusion that the riders of the steppe were a supernatural force, a bloody punishment sent by a vengeful god to cleanse the earth. The church preached it, the peasants believed it, and the kings feared it. But the winter campaign of 1288 violently and permanently shattered that illusion. Leszek the Black proved to the entire world that the Mongols were not demons. They were a biological engine. They were just mortal men riding horses. And horses, no matter how terrifying, require calories. Leszek did not defeat the greatest military machine of the 13th century with a heroic, thundering cavalry charge or a brilliant clash of swords on an open plain. He defeated them with a cold, ruthless mastery of logistics and an absolute refusal to play by their rules. He recognized that against a hypermobile, infinitely faster enemy, traditional chivalry is just another word for mass suicide. He willingly weaponized the geography of his own nation, commanding his people to transform their fertile homeland into an uninhabitable, freezing void. He traded the romanticism of sweeping battles for the cold, boring, and impenetrable reality of solid, stone walls. He understood that true strategic genius is not about fighting the enemy where they are strongest. It is about forcing the enemy to fight the environment until they completely break down from the inside out. The legacy of Starry Sachs is a timeless masterclass in asymmetric warfare. It teaches us a brutal, undeniable truth about survival against impossible odds. When you are faced with a giant and overwhelming apocalyptic force that wants to consume everything you have, you do not stand in its path and swing a heavy sword. You step aside, you build a wall it cannot climb, you violently remove the resources it needs to sustain itself, and you wait patiently for the giant to starve to death under the sheer weight of its own mass. Leszek the Black saved Poland by realizing that sometimes to defeat a monster you have to be colder, more patient, and far more calculating than the monster itself. He did not just win a war, he cured his nation of its paralyzing fear. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our past. If this story of brutal survival and strategic genius resonated with you, please hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed with the bell notification turned on. It truly helps us win our own battle against the algorithm and keeps these forgotten stories alive. And before you go, I have a question for you to answer in the comments. In our modern world, where we often face massive, seemingly unstoppable forces in our own lives, do you think Leszek's cold, unyielding pragmatism is more valuable than traditional heroic bravery? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your perspective. If you want to understand how another supposedly invincible empire was lured into a catastrophic trap and completely annihilated by the landscape itself, click the video on your screen right now to watch our deep dive into the Battle of Morgarten. Until next time, remember, history is not just about the past, it is a warning for the future.